When I walked into that room and saw my entire family seated with two lawyers I'd never met, I knew something was wrong. But when my mother turned to me and said with that cold, satisfied smile, "Meet our lawyers," I understood that something had already happened, and I was the last to know. I'm Amber. I'm 29. And last month, my grandfather left me his entire estate, worth over $2 million. I didn't tell anyone. Not at first. Not even my mother, Patricia. Because I knew what would happen if I did. The day after his funeral, she stormed into my apartment demanding I sign everything over to her. She called it restoring balance. I called it theft. When I refused, she smashed one of my picture frames and left without another word. This morning, I got a text. No greeting. No explanation. Just, family meeting. Be at the house. 11 a.m. Now, standing inside the living room of the house I grew up in, where every photo on the walls is of my mother or my siblings, I realized just how far they were willing to go. She didn't introduce anyone else. Not my stepfather Craig, not my half-sister Rachel, not my brother Jason, who had the nerve to nod at me like we were allies. And not the lawyers. My mother simply folded her hands in her lap, smiled, and said, "We have some documents for you to sign." There was no hello. No mention of Grandpa. No trace of mourning. Just contracts. I didn't sit down. I didn't even move. It was like stepping into a trap I'd already seen in a dream. But the dream was real. And I was wide awake. Grandpa Harold wasn't just my grandfather, he was my compass. He built his business from nothing. He was the first man I ever respected. While my mother spent money like it was oxygen, Grandpa taught me how to account for every penny. When I was a child, I'd sit in his office during family gatherings, running my fingers over the edges of his leather-bound ledgers. At 13, he started bringing me to the hardware store he owned on Saturdays. By 16, I could read a profit and loss statement as easily as I read a novel. He used to tell me, "Nothing worth having comes easy." He lived that. He raised my mother with everything she ever wanted, and she grew up thinking that was how life was supposed to work. That if she wanted something, she deserved it. Just because. I saw it in the way she moved through the world. Her appetite for luxury. The way she'd scold waiters, scream at retail clerks. The way she expected adoration but never gave it back. Craig, my stepfather, never questioned her. He just stood beside her like a paid statue, nodding along. And when she wanted a second mortgage to fund a plastic surgery package and Jason's latest startup, Craig signed the papers without reading them. Meanwhile, I was taking student loans. Grandpa had offered to pay for my degree. But my mother convinced him that Jason's special needs required urgent funds. And Rachel needed emergency dental surgery that turned out to be elective. She siphoned money through tears and guilt. I watched her do it. I watched him let her. When I started college, Grandpa began visiting me at the bookstore where I worked part-time. He'd walk in, pretend to browse, and slip me envelopes of cash when no one was looking. "This is between us," he'd whisper. And I'd nod. Every time. I should have seen this coming. All of it. In the months before he passed, Grandpa started making vague comments. About being prepared. About the burden of legacy. About trust. One afternoon in the hospital, he gripped my hand with a strength I didn't think he had left. "There will be pressure," he said. "Stand your ground." I thought he meant emotionally. Grief, maybe. Family drama. I didn't understand then that he was talking about war. Now I do. One of the lawyers finally spoke. He gestured to the stack of papers on the table and said, "These documents allow your mother temporary management of the estate." My eyes narrowed. "Temporary?" He nodded. "Until a more permanent solution can be arranged." My mother's smile was tight, smug. "You're not equipped to handle this," she said. "And we need access to the assets now. Jason's health isn't going to wait for your learning curve." I didn't reply. Because what I felt wasn't shock. It was rage. But not the kind that explodes. The kind that hardens. I walked out without touching a single page. Outside, I sat in my car, hands trembling on the wheel. I stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror, and for a long time I didn't recognize myself. Then I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out the document Grandpa had given me 3 weeks before he died. A sealed envelope. Inside it, the original copy of his final will. The one no one else had seen. The one they would never, ever forget. And as I held it in my hands, a slow, terrifying clarity settled over me. They had no idea what I was about to do. The paper smelled like cedar and dust, and it was heavier than it should have been in my hands. But I knew what I was holding. I knew what it meant. And I knew they'd do anything to destroy it. The seal hadn't been broken. Grandpa's handwriting, always so precise, marked the front with my name and the date in thick black ink. He'd handed it to me during one of our last visits. Said it was for safekeeping. Told me not to open it until the time came. That time had arrived. I didn't open it in the car. I drove to my apartment, locked the door behind me, and closed every curtain in the room before I sat down on the floor with the envelope in my lap. When I finally peeled it open, my hands weren't shaking anymore. It was the original will. The notarized, signed, and witnessed copy, clean, complete, and dated 3 months before his death. In it, he left everything to me. Everything. There were no conditions. No temporary oversight. No clauses about family management. Just one direct line that caught in my throat the second I read it. To Amber Lynn Whitaker, who has proven herself to understand the true meaning of stewardship. I sat in silence for a long time. My grandfather's voice echoed in my memory, quiet and resolute. I remembered his expression when he told me there would be pressure. I hadn't understood then. Now I did. I tucked the document into the fireproof safe beneath my bed, where no one could find it. Then I poured myself a glass of water and sat on the couch, letting the coldness of the leather seep into my skin. They didn't know I had it. They believed they were the only ones with leverage. And that, I realized, was my greatest weapon. It's strange how silence becomes a shield. How restraint becomes a kind of power. I didn't scream. I didn't text anyone. I didn't post a word on social media. Instead, I did the one thing I knew they wouldn't expect. I waited. When I was little, I used to think my mother had 2 faces. One for the world, bright, charming, endlessly poised, and one for home. The second one didn't smile as easily. It carried disappointment like perfume. It spoke in sharp edges and icy glances. I learned early how to read between her words. How to sense the moment her patience started to crack. She taught me the difference between attention and affection. Between image and value. Grandpa showed me the rest. He didn't need to talk much to teach me what mattered. It was in the way he treated the people who worked for him, never barking orders, never raising his voice. I watched him take lunch with the warehouse crew and listen more than he spoke. He once told me that a legacy isn't built by money. It's built by how people remember your name when you're gone. My mother didn't understand that. Maybe she never could. She believed legacy was something you displayed. That reputation mattered more than truth. I remember once, when I was 16, she screamed at Grandpa during a dinner party because he refused to let her take out another loan against the business. He'd told her, "If you can't live within your means, maybe you should learn the value of enough." I'll never forget how quiet the room became. How she turned to me, eyes blazing, and said, "Just wait. One day you'll understand what it feels like to be left behind." But she was wrong. I wasn't left behind. She was the one chasing something that never truly belonged to her. The next few days passed slowly. I didn't hear from anyone in the family. Not Craig. Not Rachel. Not Jason. Not even a cold voicemail from my mother pretending to be concerned. I worked from home. took calls, answered emails. But my focus drifted constantly. Memories of Grandpa drifted in and out, catching me off guard, his laugh when I corrected a supplier's invoice, the way his hand would rest on my shoulder as we reviewed budgets. I missed him in small, invisible ways. Like how I used to call him on Sunday afternoons, even if just to ask what he thought about a market trend or a book I was reading. Now I found myself dialing his number by instinct, only to remember halfway through that it was disconnected. Loss has a way of sneaking up like that. But grief wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was knowing he'd spent his final months preparing for this, protecting me from the people who should have protected both of us. 3 days later, I received a registered letter. Delivered by hand. Thick ivory envelope. My name written in careful script. Inside, a formal notice of legal review. The estate was being contested. On the grounds that I was emotionally unstable and unfit to manage high-value assets. The words blurred as I read them, even though my vision was clear. I'd expected this. What I hadn't expected was how calm I felt reading it. They were trying to erase me from his legacy. But they didn't know I had the original. And I wasn't afraid of a courtroom. Because what they didn't understand, what they never understood, was that I'd been preparing for this my whole life. Not in secret. In silence. That night, I took the original will out of the safe. I read it again, slowly this time. Every word. Every signature. Every line of it a reminder of who I was and what he saw in me. Then I picked up my phone and called a name I hadn't spoken in years. She answered on the second ring. I said, "Hi, it's Amber. I need to talk to you about Grandpa's estate." There was a pause. Then a quiet intake of breath. She said, "I wondered when you'd call. Because some allies don't need explanation. Just timing." And I had finally chosen mine. I didn't know how much I'd been holding in until I heard her voice again. It was like opening a sealed room inside myself, dusty, quiet, and heavy with air I hadn't breathed in years. Clara had been my grandfather's attorney for almost 2 decades. She was meticulous, private, and sharp in ways my mother always resented. They'd only met twice, and both times, Patricia came home afterward fuming. She called Clara a gatekeeper. I think she meant it as an insult. Clara took it as a job description. When I told her about the meeting at the house, about the new lawyers and their sudden appearance, she didn't sound surprised. Just tired. She said, "They've been circling since before the funeral." Her tone wasn't sympathetic. It was resigned. I asked, "Did you know they were going to contest it?" She replied, "We assumed they might. But I didn't think they'd move this quickly. Or this sloppily." Clara agreed to meet me the next morning. She told me to bring everything. Originals, copies, anything that had Grandpa's signature. I didn't ask what she planned to do with them. I already knew. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, the ceiling a blur above me, listening to the sound of my own breathing like it belonged to someone else. There's a moment, I think, in every quiet war where the weight of solitude makes itself known. Not just loneliness, something deeper. That hollow ache of knowing no one else will carry this for you. That there is no cavalry. No sibling coming to your defense. No parent stepping in to make things right. Just you. Alone. My mother hadn't called. Neither had Rachel. Jason had texted once, something vague about misunderstandings and doing what's best for everyone. I didn't respond. Their silence was its own kind of message. I thought back to childhood dinners, how Grandpa would always insist we say what we were grateful for. My mother hated it. She thought it was performative. But I never did. It was the only time anyone at that table looked each other in the eye without accusation or expectation. I used to say I was grateful for peace. I don't think I ever really had it. But I was going to fight for it now. Clara's office was in a converted brick building just outside the city, quiet, efficient, no flash. She greeted me with a nod and a brief smile before motioning me into her office. The moment I handed her the original will, everything changed. She unfolded it with careful fingers, scanned it quickly, then looked up at me with something I couldn't quite read. Respect, maybe. Or something closer to relief. She said, "This changes everything." For the first time in days, I felt something shift inside me. A thread of pressure loosening just slightly. I asked, "Do they know this version exists?" She replied, "Not unless Harold told them." And he wouldn't have. Clara moved quickly after that. She made certified copies, logged every detail, and began assembling a file that, she explained, would serve as our defensive and offensive strategy. That's how she talked, like a strategist, not a lawyer. It made sense now why Grandpa had trusted her. Before I left, she handed me a small flash drive. She said, "This is a digital backup of everything we discussed today. Store it somewhere off-site. Safety deposit box. Somewhere they can't reach." I nodded, tucking it into my purse. The weight of it was nothing. The weight of what it represented was something else entirely. Back at home, I found myself moving differently. More slowly. More deliberately. The first wave of fear had passed. In its place was something colder. A kind of focus I hadn't felt in a long time. I began cataloging everything. Every financial document Grandpa had ever sent me. Every receipt, every bank statement, every handwritten note. I scanned it all, saved it in triplicate. Hard drive, cloud, encrypted archive. If they were going to attack, they'd find me armored. They still had no idea I held the original will. And that, I realized, gave me control. Not just over the estate. Over the narrative. The first threat came via email. From the office of Matthews and Parr, my mother's new legal team. A formal request for a voluntary transfer of estate management, citing familial conflict and emotional distress on behalf of multiple beneficiaries. I stared at it for a long time before replying. One sentence. I wrote, "I will not be responding to further communications outside of formal court proceedings." Then I forwarded it to Clara. Her reply was even shorter. She wrote, "Good." 2 days later, I received a call from Rachel. I let it ring twice before answering. She said, "Amber, can we talk?" Her voice was soft, rehearsed. I replied, "You're already talking." There was a pause. Then a sigh. She said, "I don't want things to get ugly." This wasn't what we wanted. I didn't answer. She continued, "It's just, you have to admit it's a lot of money. And Mom, she's not thinking clearly. She's grieving." The audacity of it didn't even surprise me. I said, "Grief doesn't come with legal counsel." Silence again. Then she shifted tactics. She said, "Jason's medical bills are piling up. Craig's out of work. We're just trying to make sure everyone's okay." That word. We. It meant nothing. I ended the call without another word. That night, the pressure hit me again. But this time it didn't come from outside. It was internal. Doubt, curling around the edges of my resolve like smoke. What if they dragged this out for years? What if they painted me as the selfish one? What if the will wasn't enough? But then I remembered the look in Grandpa's eyes that last day in the hospital. How tightly he'd gripped my hand. How fiercely he'd said, "Stand your ground. Not win. Not fight. Just, stand." That, I could do. The next morning, a letter arrived. Unmarked envelope. No return address. Inside, a printed photo. Of me. Leaning against my car. Holding the envelope from Grandpa. Someone had been watching. There was no note. No explanation. Just proof. And a message I didn't need words to understand. They were done asking. They were starting to take. There's a specific kind of fear that doesn't scream, it just waits. Quiet, constant, pressing down like static behind your eyes. That was the feeling when I realized they were watching me. The photograph wasn't grainy or distant. It was crisp. Taken from across the street. The timestamp printed on the back told me it had been taken the day I met with Clara. There was no need to explain what it meant. They weren't going to play fair. They were escalating. I stared at the photo for nearly an hour. It sat on my kitchen table like a loaded weapon. I kept expecting another envelope to arrive. Or a knock on the door. Or a message demanding I hand over the will in exchange for silence. Nothing came. That, somehow, made it worse. I didn't call Clara. Not right away. Instead, I took a long shower and stood under the water until my skin burned. I needed to feel grounded, tethered to something solid that wasn't unraveling beneath me. Afterward, I dressed deliberately, jeans, sweater, coat, and walked to the nearest bank with the flash drive still zipped in the lining of my purse. The woman at the counter didn't ask questions when I requested a safety deposit box. She just smiled and handed me a form. My hands didn't shake as I signed. The key they gave me felt colder than I expected. Heavier. But when I placed the drive inside that narrow metal drawer and heard the lock click shut, a part of me steadied. They could follow me. But they couldn't touch what mattered anymore. At home, I began my quiet strategy. I pulled every record Grandpa had ever given me. Not just financials. I found letters. Receipts. Notes in his handwriting referencing changes to the will. Bank statements showing direct transfers to my tuition fund, ones my mother had claimed were used for Jason's care. I organized everything by date, scanning and indexing each page. I made another digital copy and stored it in a password-protected vault with biometric verification. Clara had told me, the more complete your paper trail, the stronger your position. So I built a wall of paper. Brick by brick. The next move was harder. I had to go to the house. Not to see them. Just the place. My childhood home had always felt like a museum of curated images, family portraits, diplomas, smile for the camera milestones. But behind all of it was something colder. A calculation that determined who belonged and who was merely tolerated. I parked across the street and watched. Curtains were drawn. Jason's car wasn't in the driveway, but Craig's old SUV was. The porch light was on, even though it was still afternoon. I didn't get out of the car. I didn't need to. I just wanted to see it again with different eyes. It no longer felt like a threat. It felt small. Almost sad. The epicenter of all this damage, and yet, so ordinary. The house hadn't changed. I had. That night, I started writing a letter. Not to them. To myself. A statement of everything I'd endured. What I'd seen. What I'd survived. I needed to remind myself of the truth before their lies started clawing at the walls of my sanity. I listed the betrayals. Not to tally pain, but to track patterns. Patricia's manipulation. Craig's complicity. Rachel's silence. Jason's dependence. All wrapped in a veneer of concern. They didn't just want the money. They wanted the version of me that would give it to them. The girl who stayed quiet. The girl who understood sacrifice meant self-erasure. That girl was gone. A week passed. Clara filed the formal probate documents, submitting the original will alongside a sworn affidavit. It triggered the first hearing date. Their response was swift and venomous. Counterfilings. Motions. Claims of undue influence and mental deterioration. They tried to frame me as opportunistic. A manipulative granddaughter who exploited a dying man's affection. They had no evidence. But evidence isn't what wins sympathy. Narrative does. So I built one. Clara connected me with a forensic accountant who used Grandpa's financial history to validate every transaction. She found records they hadn't. Transfers. Ledger notes. trusts that predated their accusations. We didn't need to prove they were lying. Just that the truth had already been written. Emotionally, it was harder than I expected. Reading their accusations was one thing. Hearing them, spoken aloud, in legalese but soaked in poison, was another. During one strategy session, Clara paused and asked me quietly. She said, "Do you want to settle?" The word echoed in my mind. Settle. It meant security. Control. No courtroom. No public drama. But it also meant silence. I shook my head. I replied, "If I settle, they get to write the ending." She nodded once, then moved on. She understood. Some wars weren't about winning. They were about refusing to be erased. 3 days before the hearing, a new letter arrived. This one was handwritten. From Rachel. She wrote about family. About healing. About how she hoped I wouldn't burn everything down just to be right. The implication hung in the air. They still thought I'd flinch. That I was bluffing. I folded the letter, slid it into the envelope, and placed it in the drawer with the others. Then I emailed Clara and asked her to subpoena the emails between Patricia and the estate's former accountant. If they wanted war, I'd give them one. But it would be quiet. Precise. Final. The morning of the hearing arrived with a strange stillness. I dressed in black. Not to mourn, but because it helped me feel anchored. My reflection looked like a version of myself I'd never seen before. Composed. Detached. Ready. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. Someone had tipped them off. Let them watch. Let them see how legacies are built, not through money, but through the refusal to be erased. Clara met me on the courthouse steps. She said, "You ready?" I looked past her, toward the doors. I wasn't afraid anymore. Just resolute. I answered, "Let's begin." The courtroom was cold, but not in the way that chilled your skin. It was colder than that. It was the kind of cold that came from people pretending they weren't about to rip each other apart. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my fingers folded neatly on the polished wood in front of me, staring at the back of my mother's head. Her hair was perfectly done, that same precise twist she'd worn to every school recital and fundraiser when I was a child. She hadn't aged much, at least not visibly, but there was a tightness in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. Rachel sat beside her, expression unreadable. Craig on the other side, jaw clenched in permanent silence. Jason wasn't there. Whether by choice or strategy, I didn't know. The judge, a woman in her 60s with a tired gaze and an unforgiving voice, began the session with a short statement. Her voice carried over the room, steady and impersonal. Clara rose, presenting the original will. Not just the copy we had filed, but the document itself, thick, yellow-tinged paper with Grandpa's signature in black ink. She handed it to the court clerk with calm precision. The other side didn't flinch. They must have known this was coming. Or they thought it was forged. Their lawyer, a man with 2 white teeth and a smirk he couldn't quite hide, stood and launched into a narrative about manipulation. Emotional coercion. How I had inserted myself into Grandpa's final days, isolating him from his family and positioning myself as the favored heir. I didn't look away. I didn't blink. Because it wasn't about truth to them, it was about who controlled the version of truth the court would believe. Clara didn't interrupt. She let him speak. And when it was her turn, she stood slowly, adjusting her glasses like she had all the time in the world. She said, "We'll let the documents speak for themselves." Then she began. Financials. Timelines. Health records. Emails between Grandpa and his estate manager. Voicemail recordings confirming his mental clarity. Photographs of us together, some recent, some years old, each marked with handwritten notes in his familiar blocky script. And finally, the forensic accountant's report. Verified. Audited. Unassailable. When she sat down, the silence in the room was different. Not relief. Something closer to dread. The judge called a recess. As I stepped into the hallway, my mother followed. She waited until we were far enough from the others, then turned to me, her expression so perfectly controlled it almost looked carved. She said, "You really think this makes you powerful?" I didn't respond. She said, "You've always mistaken stubbornness for strength, Amber." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. She had always known how to wound me without volume. I replied, "You're still underestimating me." She looked at me then. Really looked. And for the first time I saw it, not rage, not hatred. Fear. Then she turned and walked away. Rachel remained in the corridor, lingering near the water fountain, pretending not to listen. When our eyes met, she looked down. I didn't go to her. Some distances don't need to be closed. Back in the courtroom, the judge called for closing statements. Their lawyer offered a final plea about family unity, how money shouldn't divide loved ones, how grief made people act irrationally. He even had the audacity to say Grandpa would have wanted peace. Clara rose one last time. She said, "Peace isn't the absence of conflict. Sometimes, it's the result of truth." The judge nodded, made a few procedural remarks, and announced she would deliver a decision the following week. The gavel fell like a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It wasn't over. Not yet. But the tide had turned. Outside, cameras waited. I didn't speak. Let them speculate. Let them twist their headlines. That wasn't my arena. But in the parking lot, as I opened my car door, I saw Rachel approaching. She stopped just short of reaching me. She said, "You were never supposed to be the enemy." I replied, "I wasn't. Until I stopped playing the fool." She looked down at her shoes. She said, "You'll win. We all know it." I didn't answer. Because it wasn't about winning anymore. It was about refusing to be erased. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and turned on the living room lamp Grandpa had given me the year I graduated college. It still had the tiny brass plate on the base, engraved with his initials. I remembered him holding it out to me with a wink. He said, "Even when the lights dim, remember what's yours." I let that settle. There was still fallout to come. Damage control. Reputation repair. They'd likely try to settle quietly once the decision was handed down. But I didn't want their silence. I wanted their recognition of what they'd tried to do. And failed. The next morning, an envelope was slid under my door. No stamp. No address. Inside was a check. Drawn from a joint account in Craig and Patricia's names. The memo line read, "Family Restoration Contribution." It wasn't signed. No letter. No explanation. Just numbers. A 6-figure apology with no words attached. I stared at it for a long time. Then I folded it once, set it in an envelope, and mailed it to Clara with one sentence written in ink on top. Do not deposit. File it. Because some things don't get bought. And some people don't go quietly. The ruling came on a Wednesday. The judge's voice was calm, precise, and stripped of all emotion, yet the words themselves carried a weight that landed with finality. She validated the original will. Declared it legally binding. Dismissed the opposing claims as unsubstantiated and speculative. The estate was mine. Just like Grandpa intended. I didn't cry. Not then. Not when the gavel struck. Not when Clara gave a quiet nod beside me or when the court clerk handed me the official documents. I didn't cry because winning doesn't always feel like triumph. Sometimes it just feels like quiet justice in a room where too much has already been lost. The courtroom emptied fast. Craig was the first to leave, muttering under his breath, his shoes squeaking with every step. Rachel stayed seated for a few seconds longer, then stood and walked out without looking at me. Patricia didn't move at all. She sat still, eyes fixed straight ahead, lips parted like she wanted to say something but couldn't remember how. The bailiff had to prompt her gently to stand. Even then, she didn't look at me. That hurt more than it should have. Clara didn't say much as we walked to the car. At the driver's door, she stopped and touched my arm lightly. She said, "You didn't just win, Amber. You changed the story." Then she handed me a folder. Inside was the final court transcript, notarized. A full copy of the ruling. The document Grandpa had fought to protect. She said, "Now you decide what to do with it." And she left. The days that followed were strangely quiet. There were no calls. No visits. No threats. No apologies. Just silence. A silence I had earned, but didn't quite trust. The local news ran a short feature about the case. A neutral write-up, devoid of scandal. They described it as a dispute over a family business, cited the court's decision, and concluded with a photo of Grandpa in front of his flagship store, dated 27 years ago. They didn't mention my name. That was fine. The victory wasn't for public consumption. It was personal. I returned to the store for the first time in months. It still smelled like cedar and metal and old floor wax. The place hadn't changed, not really. I walked the aisles slowly, touching labels, pausing at displays Grandpa and I had once built together. The employees were polite but distant, unsure of what to say. They'd heard rumors, I could tell. I didn't offer them clarity. But I promised myself something as I stood in his old office, where dust collected along the edges of his desk. This place would never be misused. Not by me. Not in his name. I wasn't going to sell it. I was going to rebuild it. On my terms. I hired a new financial advisor. Not because I didn't trust myself, but because I'd learned the importance of a second set of eyes. Her name was Tasha. Early 40s. Independent, discreet. She didn't ask about the legal battle. She asked about structure, sustainability, and long-term strategy. I appreciated that. We spent hours reviewing Grandpa's assets. The business, yes, but also the properties, the investments, the trusts he'd quietly arranged in the final years of his life. It was more than I thought. He hadn't just left me wealth. He'd left me an ecosystem. A blueprint. And now it was mine to carry forward. One afternoon, as I was organizing the contents of the upstairs attic in his house, the house I now legally owned, I found a locked metal box wedged behind a beam. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. All addressed to me. Some dated back 10 years. Others were recent. Some were barely more than a paragraph. Others were pages long. He must have written them in secret. Or maybe he knew one day I'd need more than just a legal document to steady me. They weren't full of advice. They were full of observations. Affirmations. Memories. In one, he wrote, "You were never invisible to me, Amber. You've always seen what matters, even when no one saw you." I sat there for over an hour, reading them one by one, the box beside me on the attic floor. For the first time since the verdict, I cried. Not from grief. From recognition. They didn't try to contact me after that. Not directly. But word got back to me through old neighbors. Rachel had moved to another city. Jason had taken out a personal loan. Craig and Patricia were still together, still living in the same house, quiet now, their social calendar suspiciously blank. The money they tried to take had insulated them from the consequences of their own choices for years. Now that protection was gone, they were learning how fragile entitlement can be without leverage. One afternoon, a courier delivered a package to my office. There was no return label. Inside was a small velvet box. A ring. My grandmother's. One my mother had taken after the funeral, claiming she deserved to keep something of value. There was no note. Just the ring. I didn't wear it. But I didn't throw it away either. I placed it in the safe, beside the letters. A relic of what was stolen. And what was returned, too late. 6 weeks after the ruling, I stood in front of the flagship store with the new manager I'd hired, a woman named Denise, with decades of experience and a firm, honest way of speaking. She said, "You sure you want to keep the name?" I looked up at the sign. Whitaker Hardware. It didn't need changing. It needed remembering. I replied, "It stays." She nodded, then turned back toward the store, unlocking the front door for the morning crew. I stayed a little longer. The air was crisp. Quiet. But not the suffocating kind of quiet. This silence was earned. It was mine. There are moments when silence no longer feels like absence, it becomes presence. A stillness that fills rather than empties. That's what I felt standing beneath the Whitaker Hardware sign that morning, watching sunlight settle across the pavement like a quiet benediction. Peace didn't come all at once. It arrived in fragments. In the way Denise greeted every employee by name. In the way the books balanced at the end of the month. In the soft clicks of the lock turning each night, securing something finally mine. I kept the store open 6 days a week. Sundays, I left it closed. Grandpa always said, even the strong need a day to stop carrying things. So I honored that. Not out of tradition. Out of gratitude. Sundays became the day I breathed. Sometimes I'd take a drive out to the edge of town, past the industrial park and the old train yard, where the world felt wide enough to exhale in. I'd park on the overlook and just sit there. No music. No calls. Just me, the sky, and the slow rhythm of moving air. It felt like a different kind of wealth. Not the kind that bought things, but the kind that let you sleep without bracing for the next attack. The legal aftermath was tidy, in the end. Clara filed the final paperwork, transferred titles, closed the contested accounts. The court awarded a portion of the estate's liquid assets to cover reasonable legal expenses for the opposing party, more than they deserved, less than they'd expected. Clara said, "It's a gesture. Let them hold it like a consolation prize." I didn't argue. Let them have their gesture. They hadn't won. They hadn't even understood what they'd lost. The house stayed empty for a while. Grandpa's house. I visited occasionally. Opened windows. Let light in. Sorted through drawers that still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and lemon oil. It didn't feel haunted. Just paused. Eventually, I decided to donate it. Not sell, donate. To a non-profit that supported single mothers and their children. They would turn it into transitional housing. Safe, clean, and stable. I didn't attach my name. I didn't want a plaque. It felt right, giving that house a second story. One where the walls wouldn't echo with resentment. One where the people inside weren't required to be anything other than real. I never saw Patricia again. We didn't speak. Didn't write. There were no second confrontations. No final conversations to tie off the loose ends. Some relationships don't end with explosions. Some just stop moving. And that's what this one did. Stopped. Like a car left on the side of the road long enough to be reclaimed by vines. I didn't miss her. But sometimes, in quiet moments, I wondered if she ever missed me, not the idea of me, not the version that could be controlled, but the person I actually became. I doubt it. But I still wondered. Rachel sent one last letter. This time it was typed. Short. Direct. She wrote that she was working again. Teaching dance in a community center in Arizona. She said she hoped I was well. That she understood why I'd done what I did. No apology. No accusation. Just acknowledgement. I didn't respond. Not because I was angry. Because some bridges are meant to stay folded into memory, untouched. Sometimes surviving something means you walk forward without needing to loop back. Jason emailed once. 2 lines. He wrote, "I guess you got what you wanted. Good for you." There was bitterness in it, sure. But also resignation. I deleted it without replying. Because what I wanted had never been what they thought. It was never about the estate. It was about the truth. Being believed. Being seen. Being enough. Tasha helped me establish a scholarship in Grandpa's name. For local students pursuing small business management, trade work, or community service. We launched it quietly. No ceremony. Just an open application portal and a trust fund to keep it alive long after I'm gone. It felt like the right kind of legacy. Not a monument. Emotion. Sometimes, when I close the store late and the last of the fluorescent lights flicker off, I walk past the framed photo we keep by the register, Grandpa standing in front of the first Whitaker hardware, tie crooked, sleeves rolled. Customers always comment on it. I never tell them he was mine. I just smile and say, he built all this. Because he did. With integrity. With sweat. With patience. And with the faith that someone, someday, would protect it when he couldn't. That someone was me. It's strange how peace feels, after war. Not triumphant. Not even proud. Just steady. Like a breath held too long, finally released. I carry that stillness with me now. Not to forget what happened, but to remember how far I've come from it. They tried to write me out. I wrote myself back in. And not just into the will. Into the story. I still keep the original will in a small safe, tucked behind a drawer in my office. I don't need it anymore, not really. But I like knowing it's there. Not as proof. As promise. And every now and then, on the days when memory presses close, I open that metal box from the attic and read one of Grandpa's letters. They always end the same way. I believe in you. That's all I ever needed. And now it's all I carry. Forward. Always.